Awesome. Awesome. Steve, how are things going up in Annapolis?
Good. Can you see me? Because I can't see much.
Nope, I cannot see you. Your video is off at the moment. You might have to hit the camera.
Okay,
there you go.
there we
You've
go.
got video.
Okay, well, let me just put my phone down somewhere. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we got a pretty full house here. We got 15 people on the call. Looks fantastic. Steve, thank you very much for joining in. I know some people on the call know you personally. I know some know of you infamously. How about you give us a little bit of background of who you are, your time in the industry, your company, and what you guys do?
Sure. So my name is Steve Madden. I'm one of the owners of Yacht Services in Annapolis. I head up the rigging department called M Rigging, and I've been working with Hylas Yachts / David Walters for many years now, and I know Josh and Eric very well. A little background: I've been sailing for 40 years, originally from South Africa. Done quite a bit of offshore sailing, mainly in big cruising boats, but I have done some offshore racing. And yeah, my passion right now is rigging. So looking forward to this talk.
Awesome. And I know you guys are based there at a Burt Jib and Yacht Yard in Annapolis, but that hasn't stopped you guys from being able to travel a little bit as well. I think you guys go down to the Caribbean on occasion and that sort of thing.
Yeah, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Nanny Key, actually, in the BVI, just looking at a job. We're installing a big top-down furler on a Fontaine Peugeot 50 Cat. We're doing a code 0 and a asymmetrical furler, and we're also installing 2 electric primary winches to control the sail. So yeah, we do travel.
Fantastic, excellent. Well, I know everyone here is either has a Hylas or is very interested in Hylas, and you guys are pretty much the foremost in taking care of the rigs over time. As they need to get re-rigged or upgrades needed. I know a lot of people have done your bowsprit, your stainless steel bowsprit that you designed and put on these boats. So why don't you talk about the rigging of the Hylases, and obviously of the different models from the 46 on up, and what you guys do there.
Yeah, so the majority of our custom bowsprits have been for the 54 and the 56, but we've also just done one on a 70. The challenge with a Hylas is to find an appropriate place on the bow to attach a furler so that it rolls up neatly and it doesn't touch anything on the bow. So the whole conversion has quite a few components, starting from the mast head. We need to build a custom, what I call a spinnaker crane extension, and that gets the spinnaker halyard forward of the forestay so the swivel doesn't touch the forestay at the top. And then at the bottom, we need, a fairly substantial attachment point. Now, it does depend on whether it's a asymmetrical or a code 0. I think, as you all know, the code 0 takes a lot more load, being like an upwind sail. So on the bow, what we do is we modify the pulpit by removing the top rail and turning that down, to the deck. And then the lower rail of the pulpit we shorten. And now this exposes more of the bow. And then depending on the design of the boat, we've then got to do a bit of an extension through one of the two bow rollers. And that is removable. It's typically made out of a 3.5-inch, very heavy walled stainless steel tube. And we attach that with the original bow roller pin. And then, to create a fulcrum on the bow roller, then we've then got to extend that bow sprit probably of equal length, back onto the boat just to give it the strength. And again, that's removable. And then onto that, you connect the snap shackle for the top-down furler. The only other modification we do is if it's a code 0, it requires more tension. It requires more tension on the forestay, and we do a 2-to-1 purchase on that. I do see that photo you've just put up here, and
That's
that
Mojo.
Yeah, okay. That looks like a code 0 because it's got a bobstay. You can see that line going from the end of the bowsprit down to, a point just above the water line. So that gives it just that downward support. So in that photo, it looks like, let me just have a closer look. Yeah, they've extended that bowsprit beyond the pulpit. That could have been a little short if need be, by just reducing the overhang of the pulpit.
How many owners, Steve, do you think have done this upgrade so far?
I think I've done about 6. We have we now have a jig, or after the first one, we made a jig for the 54, and I think, isn't the 54 and the 56 sort of the same bow roller?
Yes.
Yeah, so we can now make that up without even measuring the boat, without the boat being in Annapolis. So we make it up, and we've sent them down to the Caribbean before. We obviously can't do the pulpit modification if we don't have the boat in Annapolis.
Sure, of course. So do you think this, so this is, as the sales technology has improved over time and more people are using, furling asymmetrics or code 0s, do you see this as being a wider range use beyond, usually be doing the 54s and 56s, maybe the 46s, the 49s, that sort of thing?
So yeah, it's become very, very popular. I mean, it's one of our hottest items right now. And, as we know, Hylases are very good Bluewater offshore boats that are very sea kind. But along with that comes, a little issue in very light conditions. So this now gives the owner the ability to sail, in 5 knots of breeze, as opposed to before this. I think guys have probably been downwind, certainly motoring in anything sort of 10 knots or less. So yeah, the more popular one is obviously the asymmetrical, being downwind, because the apparent wind is a lot lower. but like I said earlier, the 70 we've just done, the owner is quite performance orientated. So we did both code 0 for upwind and reaching, and then an asymmetrical for downwind. And what was nice was we were able to use his existing sail. You know, he already had a asym for the boat. In fact, he had two. So yeah, it was as long as it fits into sort of the normal parameters, which are the luff of an asym is typically 103% of the forestay length, then it'll work with an existing sail.
Excellent, excellent. So it makes it something that's not only, adds to the versatility of the boat, but also makes it, you're going to save on fuel. You're not going to run the engine as much, and it's going to be more fun.
Yeah, I mean, if like most sailors, I'm quite performance orientated, so I quite like to get every little bit I can out of the wind, and yeah, it's you're now sailing in 5 knots apparent, which is great.
Exactly. And it's, unlike some other, a racing bowsprit, which on a boat this size might stick out 6 or 8 feet, this is really only increasing the length of the boat, maybe a foot past the anchor.
So yeah, I'll tell you what the parameters are is obviously at the top of the mast, which doesn't affect the boat length, we need like 6 inches of clearance forward of, in fact, not even that, like 4 inches forward of the forestay, just so the swivel can rotate. And at the bottom, if we can trim back the pulpit, I only need 12 inches of separation between the attachment point of the furler and the forestay, just enough for the furler to spin, but also when it's up and stowed, you don't really want it touching the rolled up genoa. So as you can see in that photo, there's quite a bit of separation between, the furler or the jib and the rolled up asym. It doesn't even have to be that far, actually. So I believe, you want to try and reduce that overhang as much as possible to the point where you can just leave it permanently attached, even though it's removable. I think, I'd rather just connect it and leave it up there. And, there's some marinas, for example, that measure the boat length from the front of the bowsprit. So you obviously want that protrusion to be as short as possible.
Sure, of course. And then what about the furling system? Obviously, on Mojo here, the furler is a continuous line manual furler. What about electric? What's your opinion on, obviously at the bigger the sail is, the more effort it's going to be to furl the sail.
Yeah, they have come out with electric furlers now that are removable. They they clip on with a snap shackle, and then they have a quick release connection on the foredeck, and it's now possible to just have a like a key fob around your neck, and you press a button and it'll furl it without having to have that continuous line going back to the cockpit. The continuous line works very well, and you can arrange it so that you just load up one of the electric primary winches or secondary winches. So there's the manual option on smaller boats, maybe under 50, where you can do it by hand. And then anything bigger than that, you either rig up the continuous line to an existing electric winch, or you can have an electric removable top-down motor that you clip onto your bowsprit.
Mhm. Yeah, I know that Selden came out with their CXE furler for these types of sails, which seems to be quite a nice product. So
Yeah, there's that one. I've done a FACNOR before, so I think all the manufacturers are now going to be, you know, developing top-down electric furlers.
sure. Excellent. So that was a discussion about bowsprit. So let's talk about standing rigging, which I know as these boats are getting older, these legacy boats, many of these boats are over 10 years old, and some of them are over 15 and approaching 20. And there's probably a good bit of owners out there that might have 15-year-old or plus standing rigging. And I know on the sales side, as a yacht broker, I get questioned all the time about the 10-year insurance rule, which used to be a thing a few years ago. It's not so much anymore. What's your opinion on the age of standing rigging, and when should one consider replacement?
So yeah, there is a lot of debate about it, and there's so many factors involved here. The quick and easy one is just to apply an age to it, and this is what I use when it comes to standing rigging. I typically say between 10 and 15 years, you need to replace your standing rigging. 10 years being sort of a blue water offshore boat that is going to be doing a circumnavigation, or longer trips, longer than just hopping down the coast. So I'm putting 10-year limit on offshore boats that are doing trips longer than a couple of days, and then all the way up to 15 years if you're sailing on the bay. Unfortunately, it's not an exact science. I've seen boats with rigging of 20 years old with no problem. And then I've also seen, we had a case recently of a rig failure, or a stay failure. Fortunately, the rig didn't come down, on a 6-year-old boat, or 6-year-old rigging.
Mhm.
And, I was quite interested in that, so I dug a little deeper. And it turns out this particular boat in that 6 years had done 6 Annapolis to Caribbean and back, so every season. And if you add all of that together, roughly, it came to basically, 24,000 miles, which is, essentially a circumnavigation. So you apply the age of 10 to 15 years, or, one circumnavigation. You also start factoring other things too, like, had the rigging been tuned recently? The issue with standing rigging obviously is not the age. It's metal fatigue. How many cycles does that piece of wire go through in its lifetime? And a cycle would just be like one movement of the stay. And as we all know, when a boat's sort of powered up, on the leeward side, the rigging, the standing rigging, the uppers and the lowers, if it's not tuned correctly, you're going to see these stays rattling. And it's that rattle that causes the fatigue. The other thing that factors into longevity of standing rigging is what's called crevice corrosion. And that's just moisture seeping into, the swedges or the Norseman terminals or whatever. And crevice corrosion is affected by temperature. So in warmer climates like the Caribbean, it's more prevalent. It's affected by the salt content. So salty, warmer conditions create crevice corrosion. The thing with those two issues is that metal fatigue you don't really see until it's technically too late. You might be lucky that one or strands might break to give you some warning. And I always say that if one strand's broken, you've left it too late anyway. Crevice corrosion, on the other hand, is a little crack that usually sort of gives off this sort of a coffee stain like tarnish. So when you do a rigging inspection aloft, you can quite often see crevice corrosion. And that's your sign to replace your rigging. But, we've had rig failures with fatigue where, one day it looks fine and the next day it shears completely. So the interesting thing is, a lot of clients will say to me, yeah, well, I'm at that limit, that age limit, but we're very conservative. We reef early. We haven't been caught in a storm. And obviously I listen to all of that politely and then just say, it's got nothing to do with the strength of, the conditions. There is a safe 80% safety margin in standing rigging. So I've yet to see a failure where, it's just from being overloaded. The only time I've seen a stay that sheared was obviously if a mast or boat hits a bridge, the rig comes down because the forestay breaks. But other than that, it's metal fatigue and crevice corrosion that causes the issues. And the 10 to 15 years, I'm a big believer in sticking to that. You want your safety margins offshore to be as high as possible. That's why I'm okay with 15 years on the bay. You can't get into a lot of trouble on the bay, but offshore, different story.
Makes a lot of sense. And considering, there are owners of Hylases that circumnavigate and there's owners that day sail, how often would you recommend that owners have their rigs not only inspected but tuned?
So that's a very good question. Tuning is essential, is critical. And what happens is when you re-rig an older boat with new rigging, we do what's called a dock tune, and that's just by feel, really. We don't go out and do what I call a dynamic tune. We don't do a tune under sail on new rigging because we know it's going to stretch. The question is, how quickly does it stretch? Well, we don't know because it depends on, how often you use it. An example would be if you went out with new rigging and just stayed on a port tack, well, your port side rigging is going to stretch the starboard isn't. So you really want to get out there with new rigging, sail for, a good few months, probably, if you're just a day sailor or weekend sailor. I would think continuously might then depend on the weather. The more the load, the quicker it's going to stretch. So once you get past that initial stretching, then we go out and do what's called a dynamic tune, and that is literally under sail. On boats like a Hylas, you probably want 18 or more knots, and you heel the boat over. You basically want to load the rig up to a point where you wouldn't typically cruise like that. So quite often, the tow rail might even be in the water. So essentially, we overload it to do the dynamic tune. And you'll see that the leeward side rigging will rattle. We'll put, I'll guess it's say 4 turns on the leeward side. Then we tack the boat. We do the equal amount of turns on the opposite side. And we continue doing this, tacking port and starboard until the rigging is no longer sort of rattling, and now it's tuned. And once the stretch is out, it stabilizes, so that boat then is good for the 10 years. Then you just keep an eye on it and make sure it doesn't start rattling. If it's new rigging, you need to know that it's going to change over time, depending on the use, and just keep an eye on it. It's not going to fail within, a week or a month. Fatigue happens over, millions of cycles. So if you've got new rigging and it's rattling for a bit until you get to a port where you can get a rigger to tension it, that's fine. So yeah, you wanna get it tuned correctly, professionally, by doing a dynamic tune under sail, and as long as it's not new rigging, you'll be good for 10 years.
Awesome, excellent. What about chain plates? I get this question all the time. Have the chain plates been inspected? And on the Hylases, some of them are glassed in, I believe, and some of them you have to remove some cabinetry to get to. What's been your experience in the past with Hylas chain plates?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. As you've rightly said, they're not that visible. So it's imperative to be able to inspect chain plates, on older boats specifically. What we look for is, the telltale sort of brown coffee stains that show that the chain plate's been leaking. All boats have a cover plate on the deck that's removable. Most boats do. And they do that so that periodically, probably every 2 years, you lift that cover plate, you dig out the old caulking, and then you put the cover plate back. And you do that so that you don't get moisture getting into the core of the deck. I'm not concerned about, the fact that water gets into the boat. The main concern is water saturating the core of the deck, which is in contact with the stainless steel. And what happens then is the water stagnates, and there's no oxygen in stagnant water, and that's what causes crevice corrosion and chain plate failures. is if a chain plate cannot protect itself by oxidizing. If you take away oxygen or air, it'll corrode. It does take, upwards of 10 years for this to happen. But what we do is inspect it first. If there's no sign of intrusion, water intrusion, you're good to go. You just lift the cover plates, you dig out the old cork and you recork it. If there is a lot of telltale signs that not only is it leaking, but it's been leaking for a while, some really crusty looking corrosion on the inside. The first thing to do is to lift the cover plates, dig out the old cork and look in to see if you can see any corrosion where the chain plate goes through the deck. On boats that have bolt-on chain plates, we can then take another step further, and that is just removing them and doing like a dye test. In some of the Hylases, they welded onto sort of this internal grid, and then obviously it's a lot harder to remove and to replace. That's a completely different thing. We've got to then cut them out and introduce new train plates and bolt them on. So it's quite a job.
Gotcha. How often do you see that a Hylas chain plate needs to be thoroughly inspected or replaced?
Over the years, we've had, like any boat, water intrusion, and we've been able to establish that the integrity of the chain plate is still good. So we haven't had to, or I certainly haven't had to go to the next step where you've got to cut it out and, put new ones in. But I know that it can be done, and it has been done.
Gotcha. Understood. Great insight there, Steve. So, through your experience on, the different models of boats, the rigging of the 46s, 49s, 54s, and 56s, they're all, straight spreader rigs, usually seldom masts. What's the typical, you think ballpark pricing you would see these days, depending on the model of boat?
For what? Sorry,
for a re-rig, if you were to new standing rigging on one of these boats, what's kind of the range of pricing you're looking at these days?
You're
kind of a loaded question there.
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot. Yeah. What's so interesting about standing rigging? There's been a huge increase in the last few years. I don't know what it is with whether it's due to COVID or what's happened, but prices have jumped up radically. I would say roughly like I think we did a 54-footer Blue Pearl fairly recently. I think the standing rigging itself was like 25 grand, and then there'll be a component to take the rig off the boat. That's probably another 2,500, including the crane, and then the same again. So maybe 30K to do a 54-footer. I should have looked those numbers up before this talk, actually.
Don't quote them, anyone.
Yeah. And then smaller boats, obviously, less. 49, 20, 46, 18.
Sure, of course. So as you're going through, conversations with clients, I'm sure people have asked you in the past, and they've asked me too, is it possible to replace the standing rigging with the mast up? And would you recommend ever doing that, or no? And what are the reasons?
I have done it up before, and it's not through choice. Sometimes, if we're in a rush and it's just, we're trying to get the boat actually wants to leave in a week or so. We have done it, but my philosophy is, you know, they say, and I agree with this, every mast should be removed, every 7 to 10 years anyway. So if your rigging is 10 years old, what's the point of, trying to do it with the mast up? The other interesting thing is that with the mast up, the labor costs double because it's a two-man job. You've got the guy, you know, down below, and you've got the guy up, and it turns out, except for the crane fee, it costs the same. So you may as well do it with the mast down, and that gives you the opportunity then to look at everything else, to look at the electrical wiring, to upgrade, to LED lights, to look at the shivs. So it's a rare case that I would do it with the master.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense with the rig down the ground that's sitting right in front of you and gives you the opportunity to do all the upgrades you need to do or maintenance for the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. You wanna get it down, and not only do the standing rigging, look at the running rigging, look at everything else. And now, if you a Bluewater offshore boat, nothing is guaranteed, but you can check off the mast and rigging for the next 10 to 15 years.
Now, Steve, I know you guys have a an excellent welding shop there. I've partaken in your services myself with my own boat in the past, and I know you guys do some other custom work as well on boats. What kind of stainless work are you guys capable of doing?
So we've got an extensive fabrication shop. Um, I've got two full-time fabricators, we call them. Um, they're welders, but they're a lot more than that. It turns out welding is quite easy. There's lots of welders around, but fabricating is another story. We've got all the benders and brakes and milling machines, and pretty much can custom make anything. We do a lot of arches on the back of boats for solar arches, for example, solar with retractable davits with, solar plus, a wind generator. We've done what I call a antenna farm, where you put all your satellite antennas on the arch. We also combined it with the push bit. I know there's some fabricators out there that would do sort of a stainless steel arch inside of the push bit. To me, that doesn't make any sense. I'd rather combine the two, and then you can put sort of seats, in the push pit. We've done sort of underneath the seats. We've put like storage racks for a common one is for your outboard fuel tank. You can slide under a seat. So yeah, it's endless. With an arch, you can put so much stuff onto it.
Hmm. And you're probably seeing a lot more of that with these boats, especially as people upgrade to lithium systems and more battery-driven appliances like air conditioning and cookers and that sort of stuff. They need more and more solar, so you're building those platforms to be able to mount all that stuff too.
Yeah, solar, I mean, the advances in the technology have been sort of crazy the last 4 or 5 years. So solar is huge right now. And on bigger boats like the Hylases, you can get a lot of panels on, a well-built arch. I'm not that up to speed in the solar side of things, but it's become very, very popular.
What about the weight of putting that on? I know there's several owners that have, the stainless steel Simpson Lawrence davits, and they've welded on uh, frames for solar arrays. Or there are other boats that have made custom arches specifically for solar panels. What do you think of the difference, especially when you have a tender on those Simpson Lawrence davits as well? What do you think of the weight loading?
With a medium to heavy displacement boat, I don't think it does much. The frame itself is not that crazy heavy. I would say 2 people can pick it up. Solar itself is not that heavy. Obviously, once you put your tender up there with an outboard, that changes. But we find what's happening on some of the bigger cats. Cats don't like weight, unfortunately. So you're putting a lot of extra weight on a cat. But a medium to heavy displacement monohull, where you've got tons and tons of lead, in the keel, it doesn't make much of a difference.
Gotcha. Makes a lot of sense. So I think we just had a bit of chat coming in with some questions here, and yep, yeah, David Jones asked about arches and weight, so I think we answered that question there. That was fantastic. What other common things do you see, as you're doing, the rigging or looking at performance upgrades? What do you see other owners are doing, or what are you recommending they do as these boats mature?
The big one I think we've covered, and that is, getting some light wind sails on the bow. That's probably the biggest upgrade. Arches are one. I'm a huge sort of proponent of a whisker pole for dead downwind sailing. I mean, for me, that is a fantastic point of sail. You have the boom out on one side, you pole the jib out on the other side. I typically try and include a boom brake or jibe preventer. I actually prefer a boom brake to a jibe preventer, although that's quite controversial, or that there's quite a debate online between those two. I favor a boom brake. My rationale for that is I want the boom to jibe. I just want it to be controlled,
Hmm.
as opposed to a preventer, which if you're in some heavy conditions and the boat's rolling and your preventer's on and the boom digs in the water, you could get into a lot of trouble where, the brake is going to allow the boom to move, before you damage anything. So, yeah, whisker poles are a very good upgrade. People are also doing those Watton-Sea hydro generators now are getting
Hmm.
very popular. Yeah, that's probably what our most popular sort of upgrades are.
Fantastic. Had a couple more questions pop in here. Paul had a great question. What do you think of the quality of the wire and rigging in the suppliers? You know, the quality of the steel today versus 10 years ago.
That is a very good question. um, it's imperative to know the source, without a doubt. There are manufacturers that I wouldn't touch, and I probably don't want to get into that right now, but most rigging companies, I would probably say all of them, uh, uh, you know, make sure of the origin of the rigging, of the standing rigging, and there's. I don't think there are any manufacturers in the US anymore. It mainly comes from Korea, and there's some sort of factories that I wouldn't touch, and there are others that are fine. My importer is a company in the US, and they've got all the certificates. So, to answer the question compared to 10 years ago, I would probably say it's better now because we're more aware of it, and we can trace things more, we can test more. Yeah, I don't have a problem with rigging wire that we get nowadays today.
Excellent. Great response. Thank you. Have one here from Andrew. Now, Andrew has a Hylas 54. He had a question about rebuilding the floor of his sail locker, putting in a bilge pump in the sail locker, and sealing leakage from the anchor locker to the sail locker. Now, on the Hylas 54, if memory serves, there's a drain from the sail locker, a drain hose that goes into the interior to drain that locker into the bilge of the boat if water gets in there. But I don't believe there's a connection between the anchor locker and sail locker unless there's an issue with the bulkhead there. Are you familiar with that design up there, Steve?
So yeah, my partner Mark, as you know, handles that side. I handle everything at deck and above.
Mm-hmm.
He's below, and we have done quite a few 54s where they've had issues with the floor on. I think it is the sail locker. If I remember correctly as well, there might even be a tank below that.
Yeah,
But
hold tank.
we've done quite a few sort of sail locker sole repairs.
Mm-hmm.
It's very durable, and it's fairly common.
Excellent. Steve, any further thoughts you have for the Hylas community here as they, obviously we're coming into March and there's plenty of boats down south and they're going to be marching north here soon. Anyone thinking of doing a major job like standing rigging and that sort of thing. I know you've seen it all, but I think a lot of people tend to wait a little bit later in the season before doing that because they don't want to mess with their summer sailing season and they run up against trying to get projects completed in the boat down south for the winter. So what would you say is your opinion on that?
So yeah, that's a great question. Our busy time is spring and fall. And what we found is with a lot of our clients do just that. They spend the summer in Annapolis and then the winters down in the Caribbean. So after, say, June, July, August is probably the best time for us, certainly in Annapolis, to do re-rigs. Come September, we're prepping all our boats that go south again. And at the moment, we, finishing off all our winter work. If it could stop snowing in Annapolis. we had snow a week ago, and today's like 32 degrees. So yeah, the ideal time is probably June to the end of August.
Perfect. Great timing there. And David Jones had another question here. He said, "What's your opinion about swage versus mechanical fittings?"
Yeah, that's a great question too, and it's a debate. I can only speak for myself. What I would do on my own boat, and I have a boat. I'm totally fine with swages, completely fine with them, if you stick to the 10 to 15 year rule. Um, I I I I usually leave it to the owner to decide. I struggle a little bit with mechanical, just the cost of them. I struggle a little bit with the claim that they're reusable, and I always think, okay, reusable. So let's assume you replace your rigging, at the 15-year mark. Well, it means that at the end of the second 15-year period, you've got a piece of hardware on your rigging that's 30 years old. So I don't really subscribe to that sort of reusable side of mechanical fasteners. It doesn't it doesn't introduce heat in the termination, so that's a good thing. There's pros and cons to both. I don't have a hard and fast rule. All I can say is my ideal offshore boat, when I find it, is going to have swage fittings, and because it's an offshore boat, I will replace it every 10 years.
Excellent. Well, Steve, any further thoughts from your end, from your experience here?
No, I think that's it. I would have liked some more questions. It's great to hear firsthand from owners, what their concerns are about rigging. I would say in closing, the most important thing I think is, preventing metal fatigue and just making sure that the rig is tuned correctly. That's probably the biggest go-to there.
100%. I think we had someone here that wishes to has a question. Let's see, Alan. Let's see. Hang on. Alan, if you want to speak up, I think your mic is currently muted on your end. There should be a button, a microphone-looking button that'll let you speak.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Hi, Steve.
Hi.
It's nice to see you. I joined late because I got called away, but you may have spoken about this. So my boat has a carbon fiber mast that was built by Hall with rod rigging. Any general thoughts about rod versus wiring? That was a good way to start it. But I'd appreciate your thoughts.
Again, very good question. I don't see a lot of rod on Hylases, but it makes sense on a carbon rig. If you do any research, you will find on the internet, Navtech, we're pretty sort of rigid about, replacing or at least inspecting thoroughly, at the 6-year mark. And what does that mean? That unfortunately means taking the rig down and exposing, the mushroom heads of the rod. I've always applied the same general rule with rod as I do with wire, the 10 to 15 years. The beauty of rod is that you never see a failure like in the middle of nowhere with rod. So quite a few of the stays can be reheaded. All the lowers, for example, if there's enough travel in the turnbuckles, you don't have to replace them. You can just redo the heads on the top and the bottom, and then you're good for another 6 to 10 years. The uppers, anything that goes around a spreader, unfortunately, has a bend in it, so you typically can't rehead the intermediates and the uppers. And then the forestay and backstay, if there's enough travel in the turnbuckles, you can rehead that too. So the fatigue area of rod is just a little piece on the end, the little mushroom, we call it. How old is your boat?
We're in our 12th season. We had the riggers come about 4 years, 5 years ago, and they didn't take it apart, but they did a detailed inspection. Everything looked good, but I know one of the problems with rod is that you often don't get the strand breakage warning that you might get with wire. But the boat's been sailed in the north. It's not been exposed to the Caribbean or the warmer climates. I don't know if that matters, but that's where we're at.
Yeah, warmer climates, saltier climates would apply to rod because that's going to get into those little mushrooms that I spoke about. An inspection, a visual inspection with the mast up, I don't think is going to show much. Again, if you Google sort of rod rigging maintenance, you'll see a lot has been written by Navtech, who is the rod suppliers, and they have I think they have like an A, B, or C inspection, and the differences are just how far you go with the inspection. At the 12-year mark that you at, I would probably strongly recommend that it's probably time to pull the rig and expose, the rod ends just to have a good look at them.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. Okay. And let's see here. All right, guys. We had a couple other questions coming here. Andrew, yep, understood on the sail locker. I'll set you up with an email with Steve's partner Mark here after the call. He also asked, how do I know how tight to make my backstays on his Hylas 54?
Yeah, that's an open question, isn't it? One has to be careful. I'm assuming he's got a hydraulic backstay. You can over-tension it.
He does not. He has a fixed backstay, but he has the code 0 furler. That was his boat in the photo earlier.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, a backstay is only going to affect the forestay when you tension it, and the danger with over tightening.
I'm talking about the running backstays.
Oh, there you go. Oh, the runners.
Oh,
Ah.
okay.
I've asked, I'm down here in the Caribbean. I've asked half a dozen 56 and 54 owners.
Right.
No one has been able to answer the question.
Okay, so where are those runners connected on the mast?
So they're to the top of the staysail.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So they're
And
running backstays for the staysail. And I have them
okay.
just coming down to a single pulley to a winch. Others
Mm-hmm.
have multiple pulley setups where they have like several going up and down.
Yeah, yeah.
Some just going to one pulley right to a winch. Mine are one pulley right to a winch. And I never really got an answer. No one seems to even know. And down here, we're constantly in 25 to 35 knots, sometimes 40. Yesterday,
Okay.
running with the staysail and two reefs in the main. You know, I put my winch handle on it, and when it turns the hard way, I tighten it as hard as I can, and that's not scientific, but I don't know how to figure out how tight I make these. And
So do you have a fixed staysail furler?
fixed staysail sailor, correct?
And that running backstay attaches to the mast at generally the same area as the fixed staysail or inner forestay.
Correct.
So because it's fixed, you can wail on that. You know, if it was a removable inner forestay or staysail, then you got to be careful because you can invert the mast, and then you're looking for trouble. But with a fixed staysail, I would think with a one-to-one runner, which is unusual. Usually it's 2-to-1. As you said earlier, you know, attached to the deck, goes up to a block and then back down to the deck. You can put more load on that. A good thing to do, I would think, is, you know, put your load on that runner and then go up to the mast and look up the back face of the mast. And what you're trying to prevent is any pumping in that area, any movement. And it would be a good exercise to do probably is look at the movement in that area without the runner on, and then put the runner on and compare the two, and keep winching until it stops moving. The fact that it's got a fixed stay is you will not invert the mast. You cannot damage it. I mean, within reason. But you know, with a one-to-one runner, and depending on the winch size, I would think even in low gear, you probably wouldn't be able to put enough load on it that would come anywhere near to damaging anything. But I would you trying to stop that movement. That's what it's there for. I would compare the two without the runner and with the runner, and as long as there's no movement, you've got enough. And maybe then I don't know, put like a mark on the runner itself where it, you know, touches the winch, so that you can blindly put it on at night, knowing that you've got back to that position that you've now, you know, inspected the rig. And I mean, I could do it in a snap, just in 5 minutes, sailing your boat, just, you know, stopping that movement.
And with the 2-to-1, or it's 2-to-1, right? Yeah. Back to the,
Yes.
Do you still run that to a winch?
Yes. So the only time you don't have a winch is when it's 4-to-1 and it's through a cam. That's sort of always a question I get asked. You know, runners. I could write a book on just runners alone. A lot of boats have a 4-to-1 purchase on a runner that goes through a cam cleat. If if your runner has a cam cleat on it, you cannot put it on a winch. You could, but the minute you release it off the winch, that you're going to damage that cam. It's only designed to have the load of, a person physically pulling it on. But a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 it typically goes to a winch. You wouldn't have a cam on a 2-to-1 because you're just not going to get enough load on it. I go one step further, is I say to clients, in my mind, you've got a coastal runner and an offshore runner. A coastal runner is a 4-to-1 purchase through a cam. That's typically used on boats that have a removable inner forestay. So you remove the inner forestay and you take your 4-to-1 purchase runner forward to the mast and you stow them, at the mast. When you've got a fixed inner forestay like you have, you then got to go to an offshore runner, preferably 2-to-1 that goes through a clutch on the deck, not a cam, a clutch, and then to a winch. You want it on a clutch so that you don't have to have a dedicated runner winch. So
I'm running out of winches.
yeah, yeah. So then just take it is going to work with 1-to-1, but you're going to find that winch is now taking twice the load of a 2-to-1. So it's recommended that you do 2-to-1. It's half the load. I know it introduces this block that sort of rattles around right at head height, but I'm not a big fan of 1-to-1.
Yeah, and it has the clue for it, so that's the way it should be set up to the deck as a 4-to-1. For some reason, mine wasn't done that way, and I've been trying to figure it out. So you gave me a lot of explanations. I appreciate it, and we'll put that on the schedule for June 1st.
Yeah, just on that, you want to make sure that you have that 2-to-1 block in the right sort of height off the deck. You don't want it lining up with a boom where it's going to scratch it. What I typically do is I replace the existing single part of the runner. If it's wire, I replace that with Dyneema because it's way more forgiving on the spreaders when you stow it forward. So change your wire single runner to Dyneema. You do want to be able to stow it forward. So in the forward position, stowed, alongside the aft lower, you want that block to be, about, 12 inches off the deck, so that when you deploy the runner, this thing isn't at head height and it's nowhere near the boom. It's not going to scratch the boom, because there are going to be situations where you've got the runner on, you offshore now and you tack, and you don't want to, get out of the cockpit or anything. And if you don't have a stowing line pulling the runner forward, away from the boom, you can just ease the boom out and let the boom push the runner away. Some people, if they know they're going to be doing another tack shortly, they might even snug the runner up against the boom, as long as the Dyneema is touching the boom and not wire or the block. So it sounds like what you need is a conversion to 2-to-1. Maybe replace the wire, if it is wire, to Dyneema, and then also have a control line that would then attach to that block, go forward to probably the aft lower, and then back to the cockpit, so that you can pull the runner forward from the safety of the cockpit. So it sounds like you're in need of a little modification there.
100%. That's a great explanation. I've, not had anybody reply to me with a good answer, and that definitely is something I want to get done when I'm up there, because 30 to 40 knots down here is typical, at least the last couple of weeks.
What did you say you had? The 54?
Yes.
So
and we've been running with primarily broad reach, the staysail, and 2 reefs in the main, and it works great. Keeps us upright. We get almost 10 knots, and it works really well. I'm just nervous about this whole thing with the backstays, not knowing and having a good answer at how to tighten them. And there was definitely a bunch of pumping.
Right.
So we tightened down a little bit harder, but then one guy said, don't tighten down while you're under load. And I'm getting a bunch of different reviews or comments from people that I don't think really use running backstays a whole lot.
So I'm a huge fan of a cutter rig. Now, I do have one comment on the 54, and that is that the staysail is fairly small, but perfect for certainly down in the islands, like you've just said, with staysail only and 2 reefs in the main. You're going to get boat speed, you're going to get your hull speed, in probably, 22 knots. So you're good. I would then just focus on making the runner work a little bit better. Definitely go to 2-to-1. I don't think 1-to-1 is going to give you enough load. And then just do what I said earlier about just having a look at the pumping. The runner is there to stop the pumping. You will not damage the mast by just cranking it on until the pumping stops.
Great advice. Thank you. And like I said, we'll get that hooked up when we get up there June 1st to Jabbins.
Oh, great. Yeah. Good.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Andrew. Next question here was from Mark Hoffland. He has new rigging on his Hylas 54. He sailed 13 days to St. Martin, winds approximately 20 to 25 knots. The leeward side is now a little loose, 1 to 2 inches. The forestay is also quite loose. Everything else looks okay. The mast is straight. He's asking, does he need to do an immediate update rig tune, or can he leave it until June when the boat's out of the water?
So like I said earlier, it depends on, how much load the new rigging has seen, how much of the stretching is out or not. A little bit of rattling is not a big deal. I certainly wouldn't do like 12 days, 12 continuous days with on one tack with the leeward side rattling. He can, depending on which ones they are, you can, with a little bit of direction, you could just tension it yourself. It does depend on which ones they are. If you've got discontinuous rigging, you cannot just tighten the V1, the cap shroud, or the upper, it's called. You can just, if it's just the lowers, and they rattling equally on each tack, you could just put a few turns on one and then on the other side. maybe that's more a conversation I could have with him. What would help a lot is, and I do this with a lot of clients, is power the boat up, get to those conditions where the stays start moving, and then take a video of it on deck level and then just upwards. If it's linked rigging, we've got to look at the we call them the D2s and the D3s, from the lower spreader up to the second spreader. So it does get a little complicated on the uppers, but the lowers can be done quite easily. But if you email me a video of that motion, I can advise you.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. And then the last one I have right now is from Peter Neidhart. He has a Hylas 46, and he has a question about cotter pins. He has heard that using cotter pins made of brass instead of stainless is a plus because they are much easier to bend and remove. Is this legitimate, or should he stick with stainless steel?
It's not that common. Cotter pins, stainless ones, are good for like 2 uses. In other words, you splay them open once, you close them, you splay them open twice, it's going to be fine. The thing with cotter pins, a big mistake that people make is, they bend them too far. They should only be open like 15 degrees. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One, to make it a lot easier to remove, but 2, so you don't fatigue the cotter pin. I wouldn't go anything other than stainless. A softer metal could shear. It would be a disaster if a cotter pin came out and you didn't see it. It fell out. It was on the leeward side. The pin rattled out. You tack the boat, and then the rig comes down. So I wouldn't use anything other than stainless steel. Bearing in mind that after 2 uses, replace it.
All good points. Well, that was the last of the questions. Well, if anyone has anything else, feel free to speak up now. Otherwise, I've put Steve's email address in the chat. It's steve@myachtservices.com. So obviously, feel free to reach out to Steve with any more questions you have or anything you think they can help out with.
Eric, it's actually .net.
.net. My apologies.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Although
you are 100% correct.
Although I think I've got a link between the two, but it's .net. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And that will also be posted in the video here when we get up on YouTube tomorrow. And Steve, thank you very much for your time today, this afternoon, and it's been a very informative call. We had plenty of people. We had I think 22 or 23 total people tune in. So thank you, everyone. And we'll be in touch soon. Spring is coming. We're going to be at the Annapolis Spring Boat Show here in a little over a month, about 5 weeks away. I'm sure Steve is going to be there as well. So we'll see you on the docks.
So just to clarify that, I don't do the spring show. I found that we're just too busy at that time of year.
Mm-hmm.
We have a booth at the fall show, obviously. But I can, if need be, I can meet you at your booth one day. So yeah,
I'm sure we can swoon you with a sundowner, one evening at the boat show on the dock.
Yeah. I'll take you up on that. And in closing, I mean, Hylases are great offshore boats. They really are. One of my favorites.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, Steve. Thank you, everyone else, for tuning in. Everyone have a safe time on the water.
Great. Thanks.
Take
See
care.
you. Bye. Thanks, guys.